The Book of Revelation. For 2 millennia, it's been a source of total fascination, a little bit of fear, and just endless debate. But what if we've been looking at it all wrong? Today, we're going to dig into a really radical interpretation that pretty much flips the entire book right on its head. And that's really the heart of it, isn't it? The book itself, right at the beginning, promises to show what must soon take place. Soon! But, well, it's been 2,000 years. And that massive contradiction might just be the very key we need to unlock a completely different way of understanding the apocalypse. So yeah, let's dive right into this big head-scratcher. Scholars call it the 2,000-year problem. How in the world do you square a promise of things happening soon with the 2 entire millennia that have gone by since it was written? Well, the interpretation we're looking at today has a pretty fascinating answer. The source material we're drawing from suggests we need to hop in a time machine. Seriously, we've got to stop reading this from our 21st century perspective and instead punch in the coordinates for 30 AD. Because to really get what soon meant to the people who first heard it, we have to understand their world, their immediate context. And this is where that whole perspective shift becomes absolutely crucial. For us, yes, soon feels like a pretty big broken promise, right? But imagine you're a first-century disciple. That word soon would have immediately clicked. It would have reminded you of Jesus' own recent and unbelievably accurate prediction that in just a few days he would be betrayed, crucified, and then rise again. This interpretation argues that the entire book of Revelation is anchored to that one specific, incredibly immediate event. Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. This whole perspective leads to a pretty radical idea. What if Revelation isn't a blueprint for our future, but a profound symbolic story, an allegory for the past, specifically for the events of the Easter story? So, what's an allegory in this context? Think of it like this. It's a story where all the crazy characters and wild events aren't meant to be taken literally. They're symbols for something else. In this view, all the apocalyptic visions in Revelation, the beasts, the plagues, the whole shebang, that's the symbolic illusion. And the ultimate reality it's all pointing to? The historical, physical, real-world events of Jesus' passion, his death, and his resurrection. Now, there's actually a name for this kind of thinking. It's called partial preterism, and the partial part is key. It's not saying everything in the Bible has already happened, not at all. It just argues that the bulk of these specific prophecies in Revelation were fulfilled way back in the 1st century, while still leaving room for major future events, like the final second coming. But why? Why go to all the trouble of writing such a complex, coded allegory? Well, this theory points to a very specific historical reason: to fight back against a heresy called Docetism. This was an idea spreading through the early church that Jesus wasn't really human, that his physical body was just a ghost, an illusion. So, Revelation in this view was written as a powerful, passionate defense of the real flesh and blood historical Jesus. All right, so now we get to what the source of this theory calls the smoking gun, the core evidence. It's this direct, one-to-one mapping of Christ's passion in order onto key chapters of Revelation. And check this out. It's the order of events that's so stunning. It's not random. The theory argues that Revelation chapter 16 is a symbolic picture of Christ's passion, then chapter 17 is his death, chapter 18 his burial, and then chapter 20 describes his resurrection. This step-by-step parallel is presented as this intentional hidden code that, once you see it, it's pretty hard to unsee. Okay, so if this is all an allegory for the Easter story, what about the really famous stuff? The 4 horsemen? Well, in this view, they aren't some terrifying preview of our distant future. They're symbols of what Jesus himself called the little apocalypse, the very specific warnings he gave his disciples in the Gospels. This is where it really clicks into place. Look at the parallels. The vision of that conquering white horse rider? That's the allegorical version of Jesus' real warning about false messiahs popping up. The red horse that takes peace from the earth? That directly symbolizes wars and rumors of wars. The black horse with the scales represents famine, and that terrifying pale horse named Death, it corresponds to the Great Tribulation. All things Jesus warned would happen before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And here's the kicker. This isn't just some neat idea. It actually lines up with real, recorded history. First-century historians like Josephus and Tacitus wrote about this stuff. A false messiah named Theudas did appear. A massive famine did strike under Emperor Claudius. the 60s AD, were absolutely rocked by war and chaos. And it all led up to the final devastating destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. The signs, according to this view, were fulfilled. So you might be thinking, the Great Tribulation sounds like the end of the world, not just one city. And that's a great point. But according to this interpretation, we shouldn't take that language literally. It's hyperbole, a proverbial expression, as the author puts it, used to express the unbelievable, world-shattering tragedy that the destruction of Jerusalem was for the Jewish people at that time.
Now, it's fair to say that not everyone is on board with this. A really common interpretation, for example, is that the white horse rider is actually Christ himself, because, white usually symbolizes holiness. But this theory has a counter-argument. It suggests the rider is a deceiver, modeled on the Persian king Cyrus the Great, who, interestingly enough, was also called a Messiah or an anointed one in the Old Testament. That would make him the perfect symbol for the false Christs Jesus warned about.
Okay, so let's start to pull all these threads together. If most of Revelation is really about the past, what does that mean for us right now? And what, if anything, is actually left to happen? This is super important. This partial preterist view draws a really clear line in the sand. The events symbolized by those first 5 seals, including the Great Tribulation, which it says was the Jewish-Roman War, all of that is considered fulfilled, done, in the past. But the core promises of Christianity, like the second coming of Christ and the final judgment, those are still very, very much in our future. All right, so let's do a quick flyby of the key takeaways here. Number 1, Revelation is an allegory of the Easter story. 2, its main goal was to prove Jesus was a real physical person to combat that Docetes heresy. 3, the 4 horsemen and the Great Tribulation point to actual historical events leading up to the year 70 AD. And finally, the whole point of the book isn't some crystal ball for the future, but a message of patient endurance, totally rooted in the reality of Christ's life. And that really leaves us with a huge question to chew on. If this ancient, complicated, mysterious book is primarily a symbolic story about things that already happened 2,000 years ago, what does that change about its meaning for us today? What does a book about the past have to say about our future? Now, if this has got you thinking and you want to explore this idea a lot more, the source for all of this is the book The True Meaning of the Apocalypse, The Easter Story by Noel Robertson Platt.